Going back to kind of away from that example and just going back to understanding the phenomenon, I also wanted to highlight a couple of things about the way I perceive the phenomenon. Yesterday, there was a statement about the VAT gap, about how much money we were losing to VAT fraud. And it is powerful stuff. You say this amount of billions that are being lost to this. And think about it, this is the whole budget, the whole healthcare budget of Romania. This is a very powerful driver and puts things into perspective. But I would like to highlight that this is not just about revenue. And this is something that is often kind of missed in the drive to put numbers and to get the sound bites and to get the headlines out. We forget that this is not just about numbers. This is not just about revenue loss. And this is fundamentally, as I see it, about three other things. Maybe I'm missing out something and you'll tell me that I'm missing out something, but I can see three other really big issues. One is the distortions to competition. If someone is not paying tax and you are in a disadvantage, a fundamental disadvantage. And there has been just a big campaign in the UK about online sellers. And the way I have become aware of this campaign was one of these sellers contacted me about a year ago over email. He had basically Googled VAT fraud, and my name had popped up. And he contacted me randomly, and the email was absolutely heartbreaking. So he was a seller of mobile phone covers and iPad covers. And he had big warehouses in the UK. He employed literally hundreds of people. And then he basically starts seeing iPads covers and mobile phone covers coming through Amazon and eBay from Chinese traders. No VAT registration number. They could offer fantastic prices, no compliance in terms of tax, and basically had been put out of business. He had to lay off all his staff. He had to close the warehouses. The email was much more heartbreaking than I'm telling you right now. I'm sanitizing it a bit. But it was actually a devastating story. So I became involved kind of trying to know what was going on. And he actually had the drive, which is a great merit to him, of actually trying to contact other people that were in the same position and creating kind of a lobby group in the UK and say, listen, we are being put out of business essentially by tax fraudsters. And you have to do something about it because, you know, we are laying off people, it's creating unemployment. It's not an equal playing field. So I think that this story, and there has been some changes, I'll talk about that in a little bit, because of this campaign that they're making. But I think this really highlights the problem of evasion as being a problem also of equal playing field and distortions to competition. The other thing I think that is crucial is the tax equity or the perceived equity of the tax system. If we let people get away without paying tax, and we're now talking about kind of at a big level, like the stories with the Panama Papers and so on, that creates a discrediting in the system, and people stop believing in the system. And it's not only a problem of that basically if they don't believe in the system, they won't pay the tax themselves, as big a problem as that is. But it's also the kind of the lack of cohesion in society that creates. If people believe that there is rules for some and rules for others, we have basically allowed or given fuel to other types of arguments being made and other types of phenomena arising, which are not particularly were not particularly pleasant. Finally, when we talk about big-scale frauds, such as, for example, carousel fraud, we're really talking about also a subsidy to organized crime. So these links between organized crime and VAT carousel fraud have been established since the 1990s. We know that this to be the case, that big organized crime groups operate in VAT carousel fraud and use the proceeds of VAT carousel fraud to other things that we as a society consider more abhorrent, such as human trafficking, narco trafficking, and so on. So there is a myriad of factors for all the reasons. I guess what I'm trying to say is not just about the revenue. For all the possible reasons, this is phenomena that we have to combat. Then I want to just to kind of give, this is not supposed to be kind of ultimate typology, but just to give a flavor of different types of fraud or different types of evasion require different attitudes. And the way I see it is the big differences between the organized type and the informality. And I think that the Portuguese reform worked very well for informality, for example. But if you think about organized crime, you have to think about other actions that are not just about making people ask receipts at the restaurant or at the coffee shop. You have to think about other set of attitudes. So the other thing in terms of new technologies is to basically target, to understand the phenomenon first, and then to target the new technology that is most adequate to that specific type of evasion and fraud. You can't think that all new technologies are going to work as a be-all and end-all for all types of, but you have to understand the phenomenon and try to divide, this will work for this and this will work for that. So in the case of the informality, the reason why the Portuguese reform worked so well is because what we're talking about really is compliance incentives. Now, there is also big issues about the tax base. It's, again, not the topic of our conversation, but of course, the more distinctions you include in the tax base, the worse it's going to be. But apart from the tax base element, the big issue about evasion in terms of informality is about compliance incentives. So that's why the Portuguese reform worked so well. But if you look at organized crime, this is really, I mean, not about compliance incentives because they are not being encouraged to comply. They are literally outside the remit of compliance. They are not a formalized business. So there is no advantage for them in a way of complying. So we have to think about other ways in which to tackle them. And what I'm going to propose here to you is what is not as a nice an acronym as the CCCTB or the GAR, but I'm going to propose the GAF. The GAF is a general anti-fraud rule. And it's broadly based, the GAF is broadly based on the jurisprudence of the European Court of Justice. And what I perceive as significant advantages, although it has also many risks. And it implies an approach that is in essence a collaboration between the criminal justice system and the tax administration system. Not only in data sharing, but also in actively inspections and attitudes. So a colleague of mine, a criminologist, told me once that he had a guest from the law enforcement, investigative police in his lectures once, and he actually said, if we only had a VAT expert in our team, we could do so much more. So I think it's not only about data sharing, it's about having joining forces between the criminal justice system and the tax administration system. And now a little bit about the GAF. Essentially, the GAF is based on a third-party liability rule. The third-party liability, essentially, for those of you that are not keeping so much on top of the European Court of Justice case law as I am, or as I try to, or essentially as not as big a nerd as I am, essentially means that if you sold to a fraudster, if you purchased from a fraudster, if you were involved with the fraudster somehow in the production chain, there is a possibility that you're going to be made responsible for the VAT that went unpaid. This phenomenon is not new to tax. It started appearing on VAT about 10 years ago, but actually is imported from other areas of the criminal justice system. It's known, it has been denominated by criminologists as responsibilization. The idea essentially that you delegate law enforcement powers, responsibilities into persons outside the criminal justice system. You make them responsible for enforcing the law. So we had seen it in other areas. For example, if you think a very obvious case is money laundering and the responsibilities of financial institutions in policing money laundering. But now it has been spread to kind of tax. It started with excise duties and warehousing of excise products, and now it started emerging in VAT. I think the system has many advantages. I think it basically is a dissuading factor. Primarily, one enforcement is almost impossible. So the case of the Chinese traders selling on Amazon is a paramount example. There is no possible way, it doesn't matter how much cooperation we try to do, that would allow European law enforcers to go to China and knock on the door of the Chinese traders. So there is limits to how much collaboration will get you. So the third-party liability can act, and I'll tell you the example in a minute how it would act in this particular case. It could act as basically a dissuading factor in some of these difficult situations. It doesn't limit the fraud itself, but it limits some of the effects of the fraud. Obviously, the revenue loss, but crucially also the level playing field. Because if you manage to remove these traders from the market, then you have the possibility of having a more level playing field in the economy and a perception of equity. It doesn't actually punish the fraudsters, which is a big disadvantage. But so now then that brings me to the risks. So it is. I think there's big advantages to this, and I'm an advocate of it, but I do think we have to be very careful. First of all, because I worry that this will be a disincentive to fighting fraud itself. So once you have the revenue, you're not worried anymore about the fact that, the fraudster is out there. So, we have to be careful when how we build the incentives in tax administrations to basically highlight that this is not just about how much revenue you manage to get back, but also about did you manage to get any fraudsters in the process. And I think looking at sometimes at the reports of HMRC, at least, I kind of feel that this might not be really the case, and it's just really about the numbers. So this is a fear that I have. The second is that I think that there is a risk that this type of rules creates market distortions, particularly away from small traders. I have this is kind of anecdotal evidence, but I have heard a few businesses telling me, "Oh, I don't deal with small traders anymore because of the risk of third-party liability. I'm only dealing with big associations because the risk is smaller." So there is a risk of market distortions. And finally, and now which I perceive that's the biggest risk of all, there is risks to the rule of law. There is now applications of third-party liability for people that had no way of basically knowing that fraud was going to take place, partially because it happened sometime in the future after they dealt with it. So if you think about this from a kind of a fundamental rule of law, criminal law perspective, you're basically punishing someone for a crime that has not yet been committed, often in another country. And if you think about that, you say basically my image is always of Minority Report, the film, where basically you have these precogs that know when crime is about to take place and they go and stop the crime before it takes place. This is essentially what we're asking traders to do, essentially predict whether this guy is likely to commit a crime or not. And then there is risks to the way the legal system functions if you start blaming someone for a crime that someone else committed in the future in another country. But I do think there's loads of opportunities. And the example I wanted to give is the UK, this story of the seller. So the lobby from these traders has worked. The government started listening to the concerns of small traders being pushed out of the market by fraudsters on the internet. And essentially what they have tried to do is responsibilize. And I know that this is not strictly an English word, but responsibilize is the technical term used by sociologists, so I'm persevering with it. So responsibilize platforms for basically VAT that goes unpaid. So if platforms like Amazon or eBay knew that the person who they were putting on their platforms was a fraudster, or even if they didn't know, there is strong evidence they should have known that they were committing fraud, then they can be made responsible for the VAT that goes unpaid. And this has, no one is going to get these Chinese traders, right? The issue is whether this will create a situation where Amazon and eBay will have a much stronger vetting system, which will basically dissuade Chinese traders from using those platforms. So talking the other day with a colleague of mine, an Australian colleague of mine, he said to me, oh, you know, we will just use other platforms. Chinese traders will just use other platforms that are less well known than Amazon and eBay. That is obviously the case, but maybe that migration won't be as strong considering the position of the market that Amazon or eBay have, and that we will be able to tackle a lot of what is bad that is happening by targeting some of the most well-known platforms. Oh, no. Okay, so my final thoughts. And at this moment in time, you know, Stephen is freaking out. My final thoughts. Globalization and digitalization are, in my opinion, unstoppable forces. Bar a world catastrophe where, you know, kind of Independence Day, you have realized I'm a film buff, right? Bar Independence Day, where aliens come down and destroy all satellite communication, I think that you can't undo the development of technologies. Once they're there, they will be used. So we can continue to look with rose-tinted glasses to the past, looking at this phenomenon as threats, try to repress them, try to fit the world into law, or we can basically face the challenges, embrace the opportunities that new technologies bring, and adapt our laws to the world. Either way, I don't think the world is going to wait for us to decide. Thank you very much.